All right. Hello, everyone. My name is CJ Gross, the founder of Ascension Worldwide and the author of the book, What's Your Zip Code Story? Understanding and Overcoming Class Bias. And I am joined by Howard J. Ross, who is a lifelong advocate of diversity, equity, and inclusion. He's also the founder of the internationally recognized consulting firm, diversity consulting firm, Cook Ross, where we met. Howard has 3 books. And today we're just going to focus on the most recent book, which is Our Search for Belonging, How Our Need to Connect is Tearing Us Apart. So welcome, Howard. How are you doing?
I'm good, CJ. Always good to see you.
Yes, it's always good to see you. I know it's going to be an interesting conversation. We were talking about some things before we started recording, and we'll get to those things. But first, let's just start with this question of how does a white heterosexual Jewish man get into the work of diversity? So let's tell us a little bit.
Sure, of course, CJ. I think first of all, it's sad that the question is even necessary. Like it's such a unicorn for straight white guys, cisgender white guys to get into this work. But the truth is, for me, it came from 2 different directions. One was my own interest in civil rights as a kid, which was spurred on by the fact that my family had a pretty horrific history of the Holocaust, and we grew up in the shadow of that. You know, I was born in January 1951, not long after the war. So the message of my family was really clear, which is bad things can happen. You're supposed to do good things about it. And then the other piece of it was just the course of my career had me look at organizational development and culture change particularly after being running a school in the early stage of my career right out of college, and finding that I needed to understand organizational culture to make the school work. So those 2 things came together in the mid 80s. When the diversity movement really started to take off, and it was sort of natural for me to fall into it.
And you also worked for a women's college, right?
Yeah, well, back in 2007, 2008, I was invited by my dear friend, Dr. Julian Malveaux, to be the professor of diversity in residence at Bennett College for Women, which is a historically Black college, of course, in Greensboro, North Carolina. And it was one of the best experiences of my career, I have to say. I really, really loved teaching down there.
Nice. Okay, so and one of the reasons why I asked that question was because sometimes, we have this conversation in the work that we do. Are white men are included, and should we include white men? And I'm like, why not? Because we're talking about being inclusive, right? And so I always find that an interesting conversation. But so as we kind of walk down this path of, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all of the other topics that go under that umbrella, you chose to write your last book about belonging and how belonging is tearing us apart, which is the opposite of what belonging is supposed to do, which I think is interesting. So why did you write this book, and why now?
Well, it's interesting, CJ. There were a number of factors that led to it. One was, the conversation about diversity has evolved over the going on 40 years now that I've been involved in it in terms of, corporate diversity. Our dear friend, our mutual dear friend, Dr. John Cole, likes to say that diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being allowed to dance. And what I like to say is belonging is being able to choose some of the music. So it's not enough to have organizations that are created overwhelmingly by people who look like me in cultures that are created around people who look like me, and that we allow folks who are, women, people of color, people of various different identities to be successful, to be included in that culture. But we haven't really said, well, does that call for a redesign of those cultures? If we really design cultures coming from a broad range of people, would the cultures look the same as if they've been designed, mostly by white men? We could look at that in terms of our country. We know our country was designed by white male landowners, so was the thinking in that design, did it reflect some of the other people who lived here? So I think this sense of belonging is a big piece of it. Then the other piece of it was when I was doing research back, probably starting around 2012, for my previous book, Everyday Bias, one of the things I kept coming across was a lot of this neurocognitive research and social science research that showed that this need to belong, this need to fit in and be included is a core need for us as human beings. And so when we look at our society today, we can see how, in a positive sense, that could bring us together, but in a negative sense, when we're joining groups against other groups, it leads to
Right.
tribalism. Because I belong to this group and somebody else belongs to that group, and never the twain shall meet. And we see the way that's playing out today in our society.
And you talk about this in your book and in the past work about the brain science that supports that, right? So our brain is actually feeling pain when we are trying to tear apart from one group. So how does that affect us in different levels or in different parts of our society? So, for example, religion, politics, race.
Yeah, well, what you said is absolutely right. We know that when people feel excluded from a group, it triggers activity in the dorsal posterior insula of the brain, which is the same part of the brain associated with physical pain. And this is why this concept that you hear, especially young people today, talking about FOMO, fear of missing out. This is really about. I mean, most of us can remember. We can go back to being kids and remember, if you weren't invited to that birthday party, or you didn't get a Valentine kid when they gave a Valentine to everybody else, and the sense of wanting to be included, and we all do it today. It's like if somebody says to you, "Oh, I had a meeting with such and such," your first thought can come to your mind is, "I wonder why they didn't invite me to that meeting," or this need to be included is an essential need. And if we think about it relative to human evolution, it makes perfect sense, because it's only really fairly recently in human history that people could live on their own and survive. For most of human history, if you were isolated from your tribe, from your group, from your community, your chances of survival dropped dramatically. If you were to get sick or get injured, you wouldn't be able to survive. So there's a deep survival need in this need to be accepted by a group, to be brought into a group and be part of a group.
So in the area of, well, one, I just want to mention that it's interesting you say that. So for Halloween, I didn't want to really participate just because I was like, oh, it's some downtime. And there was a party happening in the neighborhood and I didn't want to go, but I wanted to be invited. Right? I was like, exactly. I'm tired. I want to just relax.
Yeah, that's exactly the dynamic I'm talking about.
Right? Yeah, it happens every day, and I'm an adult, right? And with hopefully higher emotional intelligence than younger people, but it still affects us. And there's a lot of times we can't control this. The narrative that says I want to be included, even if I don't really want to be included, but I want to be included. So, so in our organizations, there's a couple of things that are kind of floating around in my head about this conversation about belonging. So when we talk about, diversity, we've talked about diversity, or we talked about equality, we've talked about diversity. Now we're talking about equity. And to me, the highest level is belonging, because it leads to lots of things in terms of increased performance, health, low turnover. But what have you found in terms of the impact of company that has belonging versus a company that does not support a culture of belonging?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I think that one of the challenges we get into is, and you've seen this happen. It's like, well, we should be talking about this, or we should be talking about that, or these kind of either or conversations. I mean, for me, belonging and equity, for example, go hand in hand. Sure. Because belonging is more we might say the emotional, the ontological side of it, how I feel, what's my experience of being in that organization. Equity is more about the systems that actually provide equal opportunity for people, equal justice, we might say, for people, that sort of thing. So the two of them meet hand in hand. For me, you can't have one without the other, because if you have belonging, but there's no equity, at some point, people are going to start to say, well, it's not enough to make me feel good. I also want to have fair opportunity, right?
Sure.
If you have equity but no sense of belonging, then everything might be there in terms of the actual material stuff that you get, but you may still feel isolated from people. So I think that they really work well together. I mean, for me, the reason belonging is important is because we know, and there are lots of studies that show this now, that people who feel a sense of belonging feel engaged.
Sure.
They feel more comfortable with themselves. They're more likely to take risks, like put up great ideas, put up that innovative idea that's a little bit out there, and I don't want people to laugh at me, but I know around here I can trust people that even if it's a crazy idea, they're not gonna kick me out because of it. They're not gonna isolate me because of it. And that's what we want in our organizations. We want people to bring it all to the table and to feel comfortable being themselves, because we know that's where human engagement comes from and where human creativity comes from.
So Howard, I have to tell this story. So you and I met at Cook Ross when you were still in ownership of Cook Ross. And one of the things I remember going into the office on an interview, and I had a full suit on with a tie. I don't like wearing ties, but that was the norm. And I remember feeling uncomfortable. It was hot. But that was the norm for me. And I remember walking in, and I think it was the second interview I saw you, and I think you had shorts on. And I was like,
Probably.
why is this guy have shorts? In my mind, it was just, like odd, right? And so I got in the interview, and I can't remember who was interviewing me, but someone said, you seem uncomfortable with the tie. Would you like to take the tie off? And I said, no, I'm okay with the tie. And they said, I'm a little uncomfortable because you seem uncomfortable. Why don't you go ahead and take the tie off? And I was dying to take the tie off. And I think that point for me, a couple of things in that story, that point for me, one, it was odd to walk into a company that was a place that actually lived out belonging. So I'll have you talk a little bit about that. Like, why did you create an organization in that way where you could walk around with shorts on, or you could actually take your tie off, for an interview? And it took a while for me to just be comfortable saying that this is the reality. Like, so if you need to take a break from your engagement and go meditate and take a couple of deep breaths, it's okay. So I think it may be hard for companies and even employees. So the company to create it. So why did you create it? And how do you transition people to that? So I've had interns that work with me over the summer that did not feel like they could take time away from, a job that really wasn't, it was an internship to focus on their work, and they had not experienced belonging.
Mhm. Well, I think, look, first of all, I think we're all out there teaching what we most need to learn. And I've always felt that, if you can only take people as far as you've gone yourself. And so if we were trying to create cultures, if we're trying to help organizations create cultures of belonging, then what better place to start in our own laboratory, the place where we were, and tried to do things I should have done. We're all in this trying to work it out, I think. But for me, where things like clothing are concerned, it's really essential. We've got these uniforms we wear, like you said, you show up in a suit, and I think particularly as a younger Black man, there's even more pressure on you in that sense. I can show up as this older white guy. I can show up dressed down. People don't judge me quite in the same way as they might you as somebody who a generation younger than me who shows up that way. And I understand that part of that is my privilege. And so one of the things that I tried to do is to create and say that, and we have clients in the house. It's one thing. Everybody knows that. People maybe step it up just a little bit. But why do we need to dress to the nines when it's not relevant to our work? It's uncomfortable for most people. And this included, women wearing high heel shoes or, whatever. My feeling was, let's create some space where we can be as comfortable as we can. So remove all that other stuff. Mm-hmm. And we can be real with each other. And the way we present ourselves begins that process. If somebody comes in and they look like they're sort of all buttoned up and everything else, it creates a particular image. If somebody else comes in and they're more relaxed, it creates a particular image. Now, having said that, we had people, particularly, I remember there was this one young intern who came to work with us, and he used to like to dress up. And so when he started to say, is there something wrong? I said, no, man, it's okay. If you want to wear a coat and tie, wear a coat and tie. It's not, you don't have to dress down. That's not what this is about. We're not replacing one set of rules with another set of rules. We're saying that, that this is not an area where we feel like we have to police people. This is where an area where people could be. And of course, now, with the Zoom environment that we've all been in for the last couple of years, we're seeing that more and more because most people now are used to, most people I know haven't worn any real pants for the last year and a half. They've only worn jean shorts or yoga pants. So,
I think companies are going, like their revenue is probably just on shirts and, pullover sweaters and, pants are a thing of the past, so people might have a couple of pair of pants that they wear. And for me, I call it my Zoom outfit, which is really just up top, right?
That's right.
Sometimes there are times when I go motocross and ride my dirt bike. And sometimes I'll be sitting with a client and I'll just have my dirt bike pants on the bottom. So it's really interesting. So in your book, one of the things that you did was you interviewed people who were on the opposite sat on the opposite aisle in terms of politics. What was that like? And what was that your first inclination to do when you wrote the book?
Yeah, I mean, I was very clear. I have a political point of view. Anybody who knows me know that I'm a political activist and a social activist. I have strong points of view about subjects. And I had started to feel, this is back in probably 2015 when I was doing the research for the book. And I also want to give a shout out to John Robert Tartaglione, my friend and mentee who helped with the research of the book. And when we were doing that, one of the things I realized was, I'm sitting here writing about tribalism. I look at myself, I realize, wow, most of the people in my life agree with me about this stuff. And so if I'm really going to understand and write about this, I can't write only from one perspective. So I went on an interview, probably ended up being over 100 people who voted for President Trump. And it was fascinating in many ways. I mean, one of the ways it was fascinating was a lot of people on, we might say, our side of the aisle, CJ, were like, why are you wasting your time with these people? I was really disappointed and surprised by how many people had that attitude. Like, man, that's crazy. I can't believe you're spending all that time with those people. But the other side of it was very illuminating. And that I saw was that the stereotypes that I was seeing and that I had adopted about people who were planning on voting for President Trump were just that. They were stereotypes. That the truth was that there was a broad range of people, ranging from people who were hardcore, like you saw on TV, that to lots of people who said, "Look, I only voted for him because of her," meaning Secretary Clinton at the time, and who didn't necessarily like him. And then the more I did that, talk to people on the other side, I said, "Well, I don't really like her that much. I just don't want to vote for him." And you begin to realize that there's there. But we're not seeing the continuum. We're hearing from the continuum because the noise from the ends is so loud. We don't really do a good job of listening to everybody.
So that's really interesting, because I feel like when we have these kind of silos of thinking and perspective, that is a part of what your book is about, right? So it's really about, like, if it's us, then has to be a them. And if you're not us, then you're them. And that's a part of the whole conversation that tears us apart. And I noticed that even, no matter what party you're in, there are certain things that you agree with and certain things you don't agree with. But it seems that we label, and I'm pretty sure this goes to the brain science that you talk about, and with Daniel Kahneman and Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, that our brain automatically creates stories about other people and puts them in categories and prioritizes them based on past information. And so what I've noticed is that I live in Pennsylvania, rural Pennsylvania, and I know there's stories that are created, when I'm engaged in conversation with others, and there is this thought that if you are of a certain race, then you must be on a certain with a certain group, or if you have, now we're at this place where it's not just about race. Now it's about, they're connecting politics with whether you have the vaccine or not, or whether you wear a mask or not. So there's so many conversations, and those things also tear us apart. So what do you think the biggest challenge is for creating belonging, and not just in our organizations, but in our society?
Well, I think a couple of things. Before I answer the question specifically, let me just reflect on a couple of things you just said. One is that I think it's important for us to recognize that that this inherent need to belong aligns with what you talked about, which is also an inherent determination that most human beings make between us and them. And this probably goes back thousands of years when we were living in caves and jungles. We'd see a group of people around the water hole, and the first thought was, is it us or is it them? Because if you made the wrong decision, you might die. If you go over to a group of people from another tribe, they might kill you. So we quickly learned to distinguish between us and them. And one of the things that we found in the research around that was that we can't pretend that we don't have that orientation. And this is one of the, if you remember in the unconscious bias work, one of the big breakthroughs in the unconscious bias work we did was recognizing that human beings have bias. It's a natural thing for us to have. And if we realize that and accept that, we can actually work with it better than by denying it and pretend that we can make it all go away. And this is the same thing. If we understand that people will tend to tribalize, it's our nature to tribalize, it's a survival instinct, then we can't pretend that doesn't happen. We have to deal with that. And one of the things that we found is, along the lines of what you're saying, is historically, those tribes were not so clearly defined by identity. In other words, you might have a Democrat and a Republican who agree on gun control, but disagree on foreign policy, but agree on, workforce policy. But this, it's very much issue oriented. And this is where you see some of the great collaborations that came in history, McCain-Feingold on, arguably the most conservative and the most liberal members of the Senate come up with campaign finance reform. And this is the way it worked for years, these strong coalitions, and famously, Teddy Kennedy and Orrin Hatch working together on education, even though, again, a liberal and a conservative.
Sure.
What's happened is we've shifted from a policy orientation or an issue orientation to an identity orientation. So it's no longer, do you agree with me about this? It's you're one of them and I'm one of us. And in that regard, all of the things you're talking about gets thrown in. So something like the vaccine, or even COVID in general, which is, if we think about it from any rational standpoint, ridiculous that it became a political issue. This is a public safety and public health issue. It's something easily people should have aligned around. Let's listen to the doctors, let's listen to the scientists, and let's align on this so that we keep ourselves safe. But instead, it got inserted into the political system because people's egos take over. And we had a president who was afraid it was going to make him look bad financially. He thought the way to deal with that was by pretending it wasn't happening. And then you get, so we can see in that. I mean, that's probably the most irrational example we could possibly think of.
So when it comes to belonging, the concept sounds good, right? So most of us would check the box. Yes, we want belonging in our organizations, in our society, in our community. But how does it happen? What does it look like? I want to first share this story with you. I don't know if you remember or not, but one day we were having a conversation with some other consultants, and you made a comment to someone who about it was a religious comment, and it wasn't meant to be exclusive, but that person felt like it was exclusive, right? So I won't mention any names. I don't know if you remember or not. But one of the things that I remember very clearly was, this is going to turn real bad really quickly, because this person was really offended. And what you did as a leader, right? I'll never forget this. What you did as a leader is you could have just said, I'm sorry, or you could have said that was not meant to be offensive and kept moving the conversation forward. But what you did was you stopped, you looked at this person, you actually sat down and looked at this person and said, I apologize. What was offensive about that? And as she said, what was offensive, you said, that was definitely not my intention. What would have been a better way to say that? And I was like, wow, where am I? What is this? Which created a sense for someone who was an onlooker and new to the organization and new to this way of being, told me that you could actually have a conversation with someone that's a leader and it not be you agree on everything, but you could actually have a conversation about it and create an environment where it's okay to have a dialogue, and that dialogue can get down to, you don't have to totally agree, but you can agree to disagree in a better way to do it, and then move on and made everyone feel comfortable. So you may not remember that, but I remember that. So that was, to me, a way of doing it. But I would love to hear a little bit more about, so how can leaders actually apply this? How do they create belonging, especially when they have power and they have blind spots?
Sure. Well, power is a big piece of this. And I think that anytime you're in a power position, you're the most responsible person in the room for making yourself vulnerable, because if you do it, then there's space for other people to do it. Very hard for people in a low power position to be vulnerable with somebody who's in a high power position who's not willing to be vulnerable themselves. And I think vulnerability is a very deep part of belonging, this willingness to the safety to expose oneself and the willingness to expose oneself. And they go hand in hand. If you're in a high power position, you're pretty safe, so you can expose yourself more easily. If you're in a low power position, exposing yourself could be dangerous. So I think one piece of it is vulnerability. And of course, Brene Brown, among other people, has done some beautiful work around that how it is that when one of the spiritual teachings I read years ago said something to the effect of, in my defenselessness, my safety lies. When you stop being defensive, and I don't specifically remember the example you're talking about, but I think that examples like that, what happens is if I think normally, somebody says, oh my God, what did I do? You get defensive, you get protective, you get scared. And then what comes in is a mental thought, which is, how do I need to act to make this better? So, I say what I think I'm supposed to say, or I do what I think I'm supposed to do. When in fact, what's often needed is letting down that shield, letting down that pretense, and saying, wow, so tell me more, because I really want to open myself up to that. And then if it's appropriate to apologize, of course you apologize. Sometimes it's very emotional. It's like, wow, the last thing I wanted to do was to hurt you.
Sure.
And I think that's, that willingness to expose ourselves, for a lot of people, it's quite scary, of course, because we're not used to those kinds of environments. But the truth is, once you start doing that, once you start living your authentic self, you begin to realize that you're a lot safer than when you're pretending. And I think one of the challenges in the diversity space right now is we're so heady about it. Everybody's looking for the right things to say and the right way to phrase things, and which pronoun should I use. And I'm not diminishing any of those things. They're valuable ways to change the narrative in some cases.
Sure.
But it becomes too much about the symbolism and the performative nature of it, rather than the deep feeling about it. I mean, you have somebody you're talking to, I saw this happen not long ago, an older guy, older white guy, and he's in his mid to late 60s, and he's having a conversation with somebody. He really cares, and he's really interested, and really deeply trying to listen and exposing himself. And he forgot to use a they instead of a he. I think it was instead of a her or him, her, he or her. Anyway. And somebody was, all of a sudden started, it was like a gotcha game. I said, well, here's a guy who's really obviously open, obviously interested, and obviously caring. And, you cherry pick this one thing to beat him up with. I'm not talking about just giving feedback. I'm talking about really making it an issue. It's like, what's more important here? And that's the challenge I have, is that it becomes a lot about performative. I think nowadays some of the younger people are calling it performative wokeness,
Oh, goodness. Performative wokeness. I was on a client call the other day, and that happened. I was sharing a story, and it was a similar situation in terms of identity. And I just told the story of a company who was looking for more women, and the person was offended that I said women. And I initially was like, wow, that's interesting. Tell me more. And I think this is the skill set that leaders need to have, that where you're not ruled by your amygdala, that you can pause for a moment. And that's a big part of the work that you did at Cook Ross, just to pause for a moment and just to listen. And as I listened, I realized this person had some challenges in her background, in her past, even though she was the leader of the company. But after we went to our breakout sessions and came back, she said, I want to apologize to you, because actually that was not your story. It was their story. And it wasn't even their story. It was my story that I created about you in the story. And in front of everyone, I said, oh yeah, that's great. But what that did was it really changed. It shifted the narrative to everyone who was watching, that this person as a leader was able to shift in the moment in front of everyone and be more inclusive, but also even that she to acknowledge that she felt exclusive, but part of it was her narrative, and we all kind of like partnered around that. So anyway, so I totally agree with
before we leave that point, CJ, I think that one of the things that we're always having to watch is, excuse me, our inner judgments about this. What my friend Michael Shisher calls the inner Supreme Court. That body of judges we have. Freud called it the superego. Because what happens in a circumstance like that is, we say something and then we start to judge ourselves. Oh my God, we did the wrong thing. We said the wrong thing. We get really protective, and so we shut down. And I think that we have to understand that we're not trained to expose ourselves. We're trained to keep everything tight to us. I remember I was working with Peter a number of years ago. It was the beginning of a process. We were working with about 50 people to put together across this big company as a diversity planning committee, and the first day we were debriefing with everybody, what's it like to work in the organization, and some negative stuff came up that they hadn't really heard before, and so this guy who was the CEO stands up in front of the group at the end of the session. And he starts to talk about how sad he feels, because he really wants to create an organization where everybody feels deeply like they belong. And he starts crying, and he's, not bawling, but he's crying. He's talking. He said, "This is not what I want. I want to work with you." And people in that room would have walked over hot coals for him at that moment, because he clearly was being authentic and exposing himself. And the next day I called him to check in on him, because I've seen this happen before. And he immediately thought, man, I can't believe I let you make me do that. Man, I'm never doing that again. And it's because he didn't know it actually created a huge opening and huge connection and elevated him in people's eyes. That part of him judged him as not being strong for having shown that vulnerability, kicked in right away and said, get back in that box where you belong. And I think that, you know, we need to be able to work with ourselves around this.
Totally, I totally agree with you. So there was a training I did for a local SHRM group in Washington, D.C. And one of the things I said is, what makes you feel belonging? And the number one thing that came up was when leaders are vulnerable.
Yeah.
So that's case in point there. So I'm going to ask you the last question, and we could go on talking about this for days, really, but I'm going to ask you this last question, which is, so if you could share one point or give information to all the leaders, not just in North America, but in the world, around belonging, right? Yeah, I'm going to make this big, around belonging. What would that be? What would that be?
I think it would probably be, if I had to think of one thing, it would probably be what we've just been talking about is, you know, it always starts from the inside out. And if you're a leader and you're not willing to really expose yourself and be your true self with people, and by the way, I mean, we're obviously, there's certain things you can't say as a leader, and there's certain ways to act that are appropriate. And so, you know, sometimes people hear this and I think it's like, whatever, you know, no, we still need to be reasonable and civil with each other. But, you know, when we got something deeply important that's going on with us and we're not sharing it, then people aren't relating to you. They're relating to some front that you're putting on. And I think the more you can be there as a leader to let your guard down, to let the defensiveness down, to be yourself, to be vulnerable, and to be willing to listen as part of it. I think that's the best place to start.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Howard J. Ross. Thank you, Howard.
Hey, CJ, always a pleasure to be with you, brother.